The Critters by Frank Belknap Long. Inertia is what saves us, young fellow, Traubel said. Malignancy, human or otherwise, wilts under its own weight. He was sitting on a jagged granite outcropping on the crest of his land, his sagging shoulders and a straddle-legged posture giving him the aspect of a dejected steeplechase rider about to come a cropper. But suddenly, as he spoke, his shoulders straightened, and the rusty garden rake in his gnarled, blue-veined hands began to vibrate like a whip. Morley watched a rapt possessiveness creep into the steel-gray eyes, and found himself wondering how a man so gaunt and ill-colored could have turned the sloping mountainside into a garden plot so riotously ablaze with color that it dazzled his vision. On the sloping acres below were russet patches and emerald patches, and a solid acre of pumpkins gleaming in the sunlight opposite a field of waving corn. And suddenly the old man was nodding, his eyes sweeping all of the wide green acres he'd refused to yield up to the alien hordes. His acres were green because he'd gone right on plowing and seeding and hoeing. Not all of Joel Traubel's neighbors had been as brave. Perhaps brave isn't the right word, Morley thought aloud. Perhaps foolhardy would be a better word. Come again, young fellow. Morley took off the glasses he'd found by rummaging through the charred debris of an optical display case. He'd tried on 60 pairs, and his stare seemed to take on an added sharpness before he returned them to his nose. He wasn't a young fellow, but a lean, haggard-faced man of 42, with his years etched as indelibly into his face as the whorls on the shell of a mossback. But then, Traubel was so old, it was only natural he should think of a man with a pack on his back as a young fellow. It wasn't difficult to compute the number of years Traubel had been on Earth. A man as virile as Traubel still was would naturally lie a little about his age. He'd lop off a few years as a sop to his vanity, and a few out of sheer cussedness, but the way the old man's memory kept harking back to the closing years of the 20th century was a dead giveaway. The winding procession of armed Venusians in the blue-lit defile far below would have checked the loquacity of an ordinary man in midstream. But Traubel just kept talking about his young manhood, and his mental processes were not those of a hunted man, but of an imaginative lad with a well-ordered, well-regulated life looming ahead of him through the hazy mountain vista up which he'd been climbing for 40 years. Didn't catch what you said, young fellow. Funny thing, no one thought it would be like this when the first spaceship landed on Venus, and Fleming and Pregenzer were massacred. We just didn't realize we'd supplied the malignant critters with a blueprint. They couldn't build spaceships before they'd seen one, naturally, but when we plunked a ship down in the pea soup right before their nostril slits... I wouldn't want the job, Morley said. Come again, young man. Oh, I mean the job of splitting the hair that separates an imitative from a constructive faculty. Traubel nodded. They built thousands of ships as alike as peas in a pod, he reminisced grimly, and now there's a blight on the earth, and all the people have to look forward to is the time when they'll be buried together, if they're married, that is. Funny thing about that, the cities have been leveled, and all the folks I see are just marking time. But it's the green fields turning black I feel the worst about. A city you can toss away without an awful lot of grief, but the earth of a man's own plowing under his feet, the smell of fresh-turned earth when it's been raining up and down the mountainside. So you've stayed on, Morley said, jerking his bronze-haired head at the fertile acres beneath. Year after year, minding your own business, wresting a living from the land. That's right, young fellow. Up and down the earth you young fellows go, with your bellies pulled in, hiding in caves from dawn to dusk, picking up scraps of food like turkey buzzards. The old man bent and scooped up a handful of dirt. Scavenger beetles, he amended, his nostrils wrinkling as he picked out a fat white grub and crushed it between his thumb and forefinger. No offense, son, but that's what you are. There are a few cracked mirrors left. Did you ever try standing off and taking a long, sober look at yourself? I'll wager those black leather boots you're wearing came from... Trouble checked himself. Oh, well, where they came from is no business of mine, but I wouldn't want to die with a dead man's boots on, son. I have died, Morley said. I died yesterday, today, and tomorrow I'll die again. A man is dead when he's caught like a fly in a web, and he's dead, and he dies. They kill swiftly, erratically, for no reason at all. They kill for the sheer pleasure of killing. It's like, well, you see a mosquito, and suddenly there's a little red smudge on your thumb. You don't hate the mosquito. No, they don't hate us, the old man agreed. That's what I've been trying to make you see. You wouldn't go out of your way to kill a mosquito. You or I wouldn't, and they're no different from us in that respect. My land's so high up on the mountain that they just don't bother to turn aside and bother me. Not in 40 years, old man. Not more than 4 times in 40 years. Trouble said, and each time I made myself scarce. Just hiding in a cave for one day, even if it means crouching over a decaying carcass, doesn't harm a man when he knows he'll have his own land to come back to. Trouble laughed harshly. They set my fields ablaze, but a burning harvest now and then sweetens the labors of a man. You plow and you sow again, bringing a greenness out of the ash layer. It's like living on the edge of a volcano, Morley said. The law of averages is on my side, Trouble reminded him. 4 times in 40 years is a pretty good batting average, as we used to say when we could move about freely enough to play games. Baseball. You can flip a coin, and it comes heads 50 times, Morley reminded him. Perhaps you've just been trading on your luck. Maybe so, young fellow, maybe so, but I just can't picture myself inviting a gift horse to kick me in the face. 3,000 feet below, red sunlight glinted on the hooked beaks of marching Venusians, glinted on their scaly bodies and tentacled limbs. And in the background of a man's mind there is always a vision of the little towns driving him on, giving him the will to remain a man. There are no more little towns, Morley reminded him. There were little towns, the old man said, raising his rake and scraping rust from one of the prongs. And I wouldn't want the job of splitting the hair that separates here and now from something I can still see and smell and touch just by stretching out a hand. He nodded. The steely hardness had gone out of his eyes. His eyes looked now like a kid's on Christmas morning, sliding down the banisters with his head aureoled in a golden haze. A rake resting against a barn door, pigs, if you like pigs, all splashed with mud down one side, and pumpkins and wood smoke in October. Even the swill trough smells sweet. And you and the missus, you put on your Sunday best and go chugging into town in a converted Jeep roadster, and the missus says, "Shucks, it's all so close in my mind, I just have to stretch out a hand." Come tomorrow, the missus will have been gone exactly 14 years, he added thoughtfully. I don't know whether I've been standing here a long time or a short time, talking like an idiot, Morley heard himself saying. Tell me, did you feel the same way when you and your wife were facing this together? Did you feel like a man who has gone out with his last penny and doesn't know whether to gamble it or not? Trouble turned and looked at him sharply. You're not alone, young fellow. You weren't just passing by alone. No, Morley shook his head. We passed your hothouse on the way up. We thought you mightn't mind if we put up with you for... He hesitated. I guess you'd call it a spell. Home burned down with the wheat, Trouble said, raking some dry leaves toward the outcropping. 4 times right down to the soil. The big trees had to be felled and dragged up from the valley. My path almost crossed theirs." He raked through the leaves and uncovered a chestnut burr. "If you saw a mosquito groaning beneath a log, would you crush it? They saw me all right, following a winding trail up through the timber line, but shucks, crushing a mosquito carrying a log would take a kind of special double effort. Inertia." "He wouldn't have thought of mosquitoes if I hadn't put the idea into his head," Morley thought. Aloud he said, "Is it all right, then, if we stay on for a spell? You know that queer old notion about a house. A house isn't a home until it's really been lived in. You give something to the house, and the house gives something back to you. It's a sort of partnership, if you know what I mean, a symbiosis." Trouble said, "Young man, I don't quite see." "She's going to have a baby," Morley said. Trouble was silent for a full minute. Then he said, "Oh." Then, after a pause, "Hut's above the timber line, high enough up to be as safe as the rock we're sitting on. You'd better get back to her, son." Morley reached out and gripped the old man's arm, a curious wetness glistening on his cheekbones. "Thanks," he said. "Don't mention it, son. If you don't mind, I'll just sit here a moment longer where I can see all of my land spread out beneath me like a chessboard. Sort of makes me feel good to know I can still move the pieces around. That wheat field down below reminds me of a queen with corn silk hair arguing with a bishop decked out in cabbage leaves." "You've played chess, son. The hut's my castle. You'll set out a lot of pawns to protect your rook and castle, and—" Morley left him nodding in the gathering dusk and went on down the mountainside, his trouser legs sticking out from the back of his boots. Halfway down the mountain, exactly halfway, as Morley's accurate eye measured the distance, he halted in his stride, and his hand went under his coat to emerge with a small flat object that caught and held the sunlight. The object measured roughly 4 inches by 7, and its general appearance was somewhat like that of the flattish, large-lensed cameras which had been so popular in the middle years of the 20th century. In all of the crumbling yellow optical catalogues which Morley had thumbed through, such immense metal-embedded eyes were euphemistically listed as candid cameras. Did that mean that they caught men and women in their unguarded moments and presented a more accurate picture of humanity's frailties than the more primitive visual recording instruments of an earlier period? With fingers that trembled a little, he loosened his shoulder pack, and a small metal tripod fell to the ground. He screwed the camera-like object on the tripod with a grim urgency in his stare. Almost he wished that the object were a camera. Perhaps his belief in himself was no more than a fantastic nightmare which had mushroomed in his brain. No, he really didn't believe that. He had a natural bent for improving things, and the camera-like object had taken shape so inevitably that he could not doubt his ability to bring the invention to full fruition in another 2 years. 2 years? God, he'd settle for 7 months. 6. Morley wiped the sweat from his face. His hands were trembling so that they seemed all thumbs. He had all the needed delicate parts now, but freedom from fear, freedom from strain, the opportunity to work unmolested in a small, hastily improvised laboratory might well spell the difference between success and failure. A mountain laboratory? Well, he'd know in a moment whether he could achieve effective results by training the instrument straight down the mountain at a marching column. Oh, it wasn't a vain hope, for he was the only man left on Earth with a surgical technique worth developing. There was a brackish taste in Morley's mouth. Deep therapy was what it amounted to, but if it couldn't be adapted to the peculiar structure of Venusian brains, humanity would do better to stick to hand blasters. What he desperately needed now was more time to work on the skillful interlocking of high-frequency wave transmission with the destructive intracranial vibrations set up by the controlled use of subsonics. In the last years of the 20th century, beam surgery could make babbling infants of men, but not even a cyclotron beam of alpha particles could destroy the brains of Venusians. Convulsive idiocy in humans, yes. The forebrain and cortex destroyed, nothing left but the thalamus, all in the last 6 years of the 20th century. Morley had watched a few experiments go wrong, himself a 15-year-old kid, his uncle a surgeon, and letting the beam get out of control, because with all the great accumulation of knowledge and experience at his disposal, that grand old man couldn't control the trembling of his hands. Well, he, Morley, could control the trembling, but the transmitter just wasn't powerful enough. When he trained it on the Venusians, there was a brief pause, like the petit mal of human epilepsy. For the barest fraction of a second, the beam worked. But for an instant, there stirred within Morley a foreboding born of years of acute fear and blind sensation. Then he heard something click beneath his fingers. Instantly, he slammed the dread in his mind back against a mental wall, held it there. 2,000 feet below, a moving shadow stopped. The sunlight seemed to deepen, and monstrously between walls of blueness there spread the penumbra of a beast with many beaked heads that had ceased utterly to weave about. A dislodged stone rasped against Morley's heel and went bounding down the slope like a startled hare. Bounding, zigzagging. If a man didn't smoke, it could be because he had no matches. If a man didn't breathe, it could be because the air about him had become thick, viscid. 10 minutes later, Morley was standing very still, a thin trickle of blood running down his chin. 10 full minutes, he thought wildly, the whole blasted column went mindless. It halted, and then moved on without remembering. I've got them! I've got them! In the palm of my hand. Give me 7 months, a mountain laboratory. I'll settle for 4. He asked me if I played chess, Morley said when he'd scrubbed the dirt from his hands and dried them with a towel. The woman on the bunk raised her face and stared at her husband across the rafter-hung hut, the hair above her brow a tumbled mass of gold. For an instant she seemed almost pretty, despite her wind-coarsened skin and the harsh lines which hunger and deprivation had etched into her flesh. "Do you really think he's just been lucky, Jim? Or is it something we—" She hesitated, as though visualizing the begrimed, misery-laden millions who trudged the waste places of the earth. "Is it some hidden power he has, which we could use too, if he'd tell us about it?" Morley sat down on the edge of his bunk and leaned forward, hands on knees. "I don't know," he said. "It may be he's been caught up in what used to be called an infinity cycle of lucky runs." "An infinity cycle?" Morley nodded. "I told him a flipped coin can fall the same way 50 times in succession. But that's not remarkable. It happens so often it doesn't even do violence to the law of averages. What I didn't tell him, perhaps I didn't need to, was that a flipped coin can come heads 50 million times, in a cycle of luck which begins and ends in infinity." Morley rose and adjusted the wick on a grimy oil lamp, his hands trembling. "The opponents of extrasensory perception used to claim that we're all at the receiving end of dozens of such cycles, where all the lucky runs just happen to come together in a little segment of space-time we've been caught out in. For all we know, Trouble may be at the receiving end of a cycle that has luck with Venusians stamped all over it." Arlene Morley half rose, her eyes bright with the dawning hope. "Then if that's true, Jim, he'll be safe here. Your son and mine safe in a green mountain land that's protected by something no power on earth can break." Morley's face was grim. "No, I don't think so. The introduction of an extraneous factor would invalidate the probability factor. Just our being here would... Well, we've jarred the hand that does the flipping. Our presence here may bring down the thunder.
But that's just a theory, isn't it? It can't be proved.
Morley said, Just a wild guess, of course. I didn't mean to sound so dogmatic. There's probably no such thing as an infinity cycle of lucky runs anyway. Traubel claims it's just inertia which keeps the critters, he calls them critters, from climbing the mountain and laying waste to his land. Just inertia.
Maybe he's right, Arlene said. Remember how the others were all cut down, then remember how it stopped an instant before it reached us and went off down the road.
White-lipped, Morley nodded.
The road was a shambles. We had to stumble over their bodies to get to the cave, the bodies of men and women cut in two by...
Stop that! Morley's palms were sweating. Stop it, you hear?
Twisted, crushed, Arlene said tonelessly. Limbs torn off.
She began to sway from side to side, her nostrils quivering.
Our son will never know a safer world. We won't be his real parents. He'll be cradled in the lap of terror, and when he cries, death will suckle him. If he doesn't cry, if he's born dry-eyed, so much the worse for him. Tears are a coward's refuge, but we have to be cowards or go mad. He'll curse the day he was born.
Morley started to move toward her across the hut. Before he'd advanced a foot, his scalp began to tingle, and he felt a coldness start up his spine. For an instant he stood utterly motionless, staring at his wife. Then terror began to tug at his wrists, tug at his mouth. For perhaps a full minute it was an ambiguous sort of terror. He thought at first his wife's features were distorted because his own were. He lost control over his features, especially his lips. He couldn't stop the twitching of his lips, but mercifully, for a moment, he was permitted to believe that the terror which he felt had simply communicated itself to his wife. Then he saw that it was much more than that. She was feeling it too. Her palms were pressed to her temples, and she was staring past him at the slowly opening door of the hut. The pattern never varied. It was always the same, a coldness, a fullness, a tightness, holding the muscles rigid, paralyzing the will to resist. The nearness of a Venusian did something to the human brain that could not be explained by any of the known laws of nature. There were unknown laws, patterns dimly suspected to exist, and laws which had almost been grasped and dragged out into the light. But compared to that power, whatever it was, telepathy was like a tiny wax candle sputtering in the glow of a billion candle-power light. It was a power which could flatten a human body in a split second of time, flatten it as though by a blow from a gigantic mace. It was a power which no ordinary human weapon could withstand, or ever hope to withstand. It could twist, maim, tear, rend, crush. It could move slantwise like a buzzsaw across a column of men. It could rip holes in the earth. It could pile up the dead in stiffening rows like cordwood. Morley tried in vain to moisten his lips. The patient, his mind seemed to be saying, should be kept in a dark room and nutrient enemata administered. That, according to an old medical book he'd read once, was the prescribed treatment for rabies. Never a recorded cure in all of the history of rabies, but the patient had to be fed, the agony had to be prolonged, in order to exhaust all of the non-existent possibilities of a cure. The compact little energy weapon in Morley's clasp had never destroyed a Venusian. It never could destroy a Venusian. It was as useless as a cure for rabies. But instinctively his hand had traveled under his begrimed oversuit, grasped the weapon, and drawn it forth. He knew he'd be caught up mauled, twisted, before he could blast. And if he were caught up with his work uncompleted, there could be no cure for a disease which had blotted out the sunlight for the entire human race. No cure, worse than rabies. Slam! An opening door closes, a leaf is torn from a book, and perhaps there is a breathtaking instant when a man does what he can. Goodbye, he thought. Goodbye, darling. Goodbye, James Morley, Jr. Why did a man instinctively assume that his firstborn would be a boy? Morley suddenly saw that the door had swung so wide there was no longer a barrier between his straining eyes and the night without. The form looming in the doorway conveyed an illusion of having laboriously impressed itself upon the sky. It was faintly rimmed with light, and the stars which glimmered on both sides of it seemed to be rushing together as though its bulk had torn a rent in the warp and woof stuff of the physical universe. Even in broad daylight, the bulk of the Venusian would have blotted out the natural brilliant green of the mountainside up which it had come. Now it seemed to blot out more than the mountainside, seemed to catch at the starlight and distort the sky itself, so that the light-threaded firmament above and behind it reminded Morley of a collapsing shroud. There was an awful instant when time seemed to miss a beat. Morley felt his fingers tighten on the blaster, felt a scalp tighten all over his head. Then, as in a dream from which he had been rudely awakened by something to which he could not give a name, he heard a ghostly, faint fluttering behind him, and a voice said, "Cuckoo, cuckoo, 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 cuckoo." Slowly, Morley turned his head. As he did so, the fluttering was resumed, and the door of the clock banged shut on a feathered mite. Morley had noticed the clock hanging on the wall, but now he seemed to be staring at it through the wide, stationary eyes of a madman. A magical clock! Morley had heard of such things, gadgets which dated back to the middle years of the 19th century. He had noticed this one in particular because weighted bellows under glass had always held a peculiar fascination for him. By the push of a wire given to the body of a bird, it could be bent forward, the wings and tail raised, the beak opened. The bulkiness in the doorway must have shared Morley's interest in the clock, for it crossed the hut so rapidly that a light-rimmed after-image appeared to hover in its wake. There was a moment of silence while it stared at the clock, all of its malignancy humped together in a towering, overwhelming wave that could be felt in every part of the room. Then, slowly, methodically, the Venusian began to dismantle the clock. There was a metallic clatter, a ripping sound, and something that looked like the intestines of a robot gleamed for an instant between its scaly hands. Then the door behind which the cuckoo had taken refuge was torn from its hinges, and the pathetic mite was lifted out on a dangling filament, its neck distended, its white breast feathers flecked with grease. The Venusian departed without uttering a sound. It simply swung about, recrossed the room, and went clumping out into the night, half the clock dangling from the amorphous limb-like structure which jutted from its breast. After what seemed like an eternity, the back door of the hut opened a crack, and a familiar voice said, "I forgot to tell you, son, that I have a few solitary visitors. Now and again, one of the critters will leave the line of march and come clumping up the mountainside. If you saw a mosquito across the room and your thumb began to itch, you'd cross the room on a sudden impulse, maybe, and smash it." The door opened wider, and a rusty garden rake clattered against the jamb. "But you wouldn't have to cross the room, son. You'd almost as soon as not. And if, when you're raising your thumb, a hand reaches out from the wall and says, 'Clasp me,' or the wallpaper turns from green to pink, your interest shifts, and there's time for inertia to set in. You become interested in the wallpaper, and the mosquito just doesn't get crushed." The rake made a rasping sound on the floor. Pawns. That clock was a pawn, and I've set other pawns out on the mountainside to protect my rook just in case one of the critters turns aside and starts up. I've been playing a game with them for more than 30 years now, son. It isn't often one of them gets as far as the hut." A low chuckle came from the doorway. "Interested? You bet it was interested. A cuckoo clock is about the rarest mechanical gadget on Earth. Not many of 'em left. Not one Venusian in 50,000 has seen one. No, make that 50 million. And they do like to imitate things. They like to pull gadgets apart. There's just that little interval between impulse and inertia which has to be bridged." "Good Lord!" Morley choked. "It came in through the front door, didn't it? You came in through this door, I guess, or you'd have heard the birdie too. Cuckoo, cuckoo, because just coming in through the front door activates the clock. You see, son, there's a photoelectric beam in the front door, and the poisonous critter brought the birdie out the instant it stepped into my parlor." Morley wiped the sweat from his face. He had all the needed delicate parts and freedom from fear, freedom from strain, the opportunity to work unmolested in a small, hastily improvised laboratory might well spell the difference between success and failure. Might. Would. And he wouldn't have to settle for 4 months now. He'd have all the time he needed to perfect the instrument. The door made a rasping sound as it was thrown wide. Traubel stumbled a little as he crossed the hut. He crossed to the washstand, poured out some water, and started fumbling around for a cake of soap on the cluttered shelf where he kept his shaving kit, a few necessary drugs, and a dog-eared calendar dating back to the late years of the 20th century. "I'm glad you and the missus are going to stay for a spell, son," he said. "You've no idea how lonely it gets up here when the crickets stop chirping and the nights start getting longer. You see, son, I've been stone blind now, going on 18 years.